Indigenous authors that I, as a white settler scholar of Indigenous literatures, have the privilege of working here at the Queen's University in the Kingstown, and that there are responsibilities that flow from that reality. Now we are getting to the final days of the term. Here we are, late November. I hope everyone's doing okay, and I hope that you're checking in on one another. I know that this is the time of term where things get busy, and there are probably many things on everyone's mind. And I guess I just want to remind us that these talks, these opportunities to share critical and creative work, they're an opportunity to let everything else go. Take the marking that you have to do, take the assignment that's in the back of your mind, take those and put them in your back pocket. Let's forget about them, and let's sit together with some ideas and challenges and analyses, and just be really present here today, okay? And I hope we can be nourished, come out of this space in a good way, and with some wonderful ideas from our visiting speaker, whom I will introduce presently. I'd like to welcome Johanna Bird to our intellectual community. Johanna is a member of Peguis First Nation and Treaty 1 territory out on the prairies. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at McMaster University and a predoctoral fellow in Indigenous Studies and English here at Queen's. Johanna has a SSHRC-funded research project which considers how Indigenous writers express their relational epistemologies in fraught contexts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Saskatchewan, and Manitowapo, or Manitoba, in lands claimed by Canada. Her work is deeply invested in decolonial archival methodologies as she engages with Indigenous writing and storytelling practice by looking at late 19th and early 20th century letters, speeches, autobiographies, and traditional stories by Nehiyaw, Amishkego, Anishinaabe, and Métis writers and orators. And recently, I will say, I've had the great privilege of working with Johanna and some other scholars on a readers forum for Deanna Rader's most recent book, Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition. And I was just the other day reading again your contribution, which really looks at how we as critics and readers need to follow the clues and instincts and hunches and signs and inklings that occur to us when we're engaging with other work, and follow those to pathways of meaning. And anyway, I really appreciate your work in that regard. So please join me in welcoming Johanna.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for that warm welcome. I am very glad to be here. I will say, sorry, I apologize to those of you I've already made this joke to, but I texted my spouse earlier today saying, I've already spilled soup on my coat sleeve. Chaos is the order of the day. So I really hope the elevator gets fixed. That's bad that it's busted for accessibility. But I thank you all for being here. And yeah, I'm grateful to have this opportunity to tell you a bit about my work and think with you about the lands and texts and materials of the places that I'm trying to think more deeply about and think critically about like what it means and how it looks to be in relation to them. So thank you all for being here and taking the time. It's been an honor to be a predoctoral fellow at Queen's and hosted by this department. And thank you to folks in Indigenous Studies who have welcomed me and hosted me as well, and to the friends and colleagues I've made and met along the way. I'm going to be talking about relationality, but one of the things that I think Sam didn't mention about the piece that I wrote, and maybe it means that I need to revise it to make it stronger, is that we follow the hunches and like the questions, but also these things come more fully like in collaboration with people. And even just like some of the work that I've been doing, there are these moments of question or like wondering about what's going on in a particular text, and then going to the Indigenous Literary Studies Association gathering and meeting people whose kokums and mushums have the oral history, who can then confirm my hunch and qualify it and nuance it and take it further and tell me about the history that they know, and then connect to my ancestors' history and, you know, our legal, political, shared, you know, alliances and conflicts historically, and how these things come out more fully as we are engaged in conversation and with people who are also have stakes in the work that we do. So I want to acknowledge that because I'm talking about Treaty 4 today, but I am not, I've spent time in Treaty 4, but I'm a Treaty 1 person, and that's where my band is located, Peguis First Nation. And I also want to just say thanks again to and acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and other Indigenous folks of this territory and what they've taught me, including Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and other Indigenous folks in Hamilton as well, and Six Nations of the Grand River. The things that I've learned coming from the prairies and spending time in this part of the world and learning from people here as well. So I just want to acknowledge those debts, not debts, those gifts, and say thank you as well. Because it's very easy as a researcher to stand up here and be like, I'm an individual doing all this work, and we're trying to at least. And but there are, I think, the acknowledgement pages of anything that I publish will be very long, because that is something I really believe is that this work doesn't. We may be taught or coached in this work happening in isolation, but there's a huge necessity in that it not. And there are a lot of people thinking critically about that. So what I'm going to do today is start by providing some background on my research and my approach to thinking about against Treaty 4. And then that background will lead into my discussion, reading, interaction with Treaty 4. And then I'll just end with some observations from those observations. And I think there are aspects of my methodology that will come out as we move through that you'll be able to see kind of at work, that we can maybe talk about later. Yeah, okay. So this image, as you can, well, it's from the prairies. This is from Treaty 4. This is an image of Fort Capel from Wikimedia Commons. I'm not sure which part of Echo Lake it's looking at. I think I did look that up at one point, and it escapes me now. But it's looking kind of out over part of the site of where Treaty 4 was negotiated. And I wanted to show this picture because in my own research it's become increasingly important, as you will see, as I'll try to discuss a little bit later, that in the work of trying to enliven and our historical imagination and our literary imagination of Indigenous presence in the prairies, I find that extra textual or other kinds of texts or matter for how we engage with the literary. So this is called Reading Texts in Place, Revisiting Treaty 4. Just to kind of, I mean, many of you have seen this map, if not all of you. It's a common treaty map that gets shown when illustrating the numbered treaties. Just a reminder again that this is only showing roughly the areas of the numbered treaties, not all of the treaties or agreements or non-agreements that cover the land that we now call Canada. So the numbered treaties sometimes get a lot of attention, but they're not the whole thing. This is Treaty 1. Where my band is located, and getting up into Treaty 2. I have cousins with relatives up in Treaty 2 because when our land was illegally surrendered and the reserve was pushed up north, then when we moved into what is now southern Manitoba, our band made kin with Cree in the area, and then moved further north, and then folks made kin with Mushkego Cree folks up there as well. And I had the privilege actually of being able to go on a boat and go up to see our culture camp, which was really fun with some cousins that I had just met. This is Treaty 4, roughly again, the area that we're discussing. I'm also trying to think about affect and expressions of feeling in Treaty 6, so if in the question period you want to hear me go off on that a little bit, I can. But we're going to try and focus on Treaty 4. This is not Treaty 4, this is in Treaty 1. This is a photo of the Red River and the forks. So to the left here, this is facing south, is a kind of branch of the Red River, and then this is the main trunk of the river. It flows north toward Lake Winnipeg and is part of the very large Lake Winnipeg watershed. And Negon Sinclair has an interesting essay about watery poetics in Lake Winnipeg, which I recommend, and which has been helpful for my thinking about land and place. That's not me in the photo, that's a sibling. I like to kind of begin home, and that's where I try to begin in my research project, is thinking first about the writings and speeches that we have of Chief Pegwis, who our band is named after. And then moving outward from that home location to thinking about neighboring nations and bands. And it's an imperfect movement, but thinking about not just, what's going on in our community, but also like more broadly, what texts are coming out of other communities' experience and life in the late 19th, early 20th century, which is the period that I'm looking at. So, as Sam said, and as I kind of said, I am interested in what early Indigenous writing in English in particular, I'm not looking at French texts, what it shows of Negiao, Mushkego, Cree, Anishinaabe, Métis, or relationships to land and place, and how they get framed within the moments of these pieces being made or expressed. Now, of course, that phrase, Indigenous writing in English, is complicated and should be, and I'll say why in a little bit. Some of you probably could guess why or know why. I look at late 19th or 20th century diaries, letters, autobiography, etc. And these texts include political writing, missionary writing, memory works, interviews, for example, where someone told their story to a non-Indigenous anthropologist or, in one case, geologist who was collecting stories. And I'm interested in, what can I learn from these texts about relationships to place? What did Indigenous people think, insofar as we can even make claims in that direction, about their own philosophies of relation more broadly, relationship to place and land, and how those informed their discursive acts and practices in engaging with newcomer populations, especially in this really heightened period of colonial incursion and displacement. Because they are dealing with radical transformations of Indigenous land and life, right? So you have in this period disease epidemics, Indigenous people are actually seeing their lives transformed, literally seeing it. Disease epidemics, Canadian government's Assimilation Project, decimation of the bison, intensive missionizing efforts, the number of treaties, the Indian Act that included policies that banned ceremony in addition to other constraints, the establishment and confinement on the reserves and a pass-through pass system as well, and residential schooling. So how did these writers and orators negotiate all this stuff? And that's a really complicated question, and people have been trying to write about it, particularly in history and in law, but write about it for a while. But again, my project is to reanimate for myself, and hopefully for whomever comes into contact with this work, our sense of, okay, good to know, just fidget with the trackpad. Our sense of Indigenous life and presence on the prairies as Indigenous space and place versus wild land to be civilized, empty land to be settled and filled, unused land as a resource to be cultivated and extracted, right? So I'm doing a kind of kinscaping work in my project, to borrow a term from Métis poet Marilyn Dumont and her colleagues at the University of Alberta and the Métis Kinscapes Project, where they're mapping stories and different kin connections and Métis history in Alberta, but it's also into known as Saskatchewan, right? Because these borders are not, didn't confine movement to a certain way. Sam referred to my piece on Deanna Rader's book, so I'm kind of invoking it a bit. And I do think like many of us have what I call like these inciting moments in research. They incite us, and they may not even be like articulated. They might be like hunches, senses, like instincts, affect. And I think increasingly we're seeing people think with and about the possibilities and also like constraints around thinking this way. And so for this project, for me, one of those inciting moments was in hindsight. In the moment, I didn't know what was going to happen, but as an undergraduate student in a college library, just like there weren't a lot of offerings at the time in many post-secondary institutions, not just at the one I was at, of Indigenous literary courses, or Indigenous knowledge courses, Indigenous studies courses, history, etc. And so I was just kind of casually like browsing, as I did in the library, and came across Penny Patron's First People, First Voices, which is a pretty important book in my field, albeit it has its own challenges and problems. But what Penny Petroni tried to do is, she's an Italian scholar from Thunder Bay who tried to collect Indigenous writing, and she was interested in earlier Indigenous writing. So excerpts from the Jesuit Relations, missionary diaries, like speeches, because I think she was thinking like this area of work is understudied, and so we need resources for people to look at. There are problems with the process of how she went to make this collection, and also the book itself is it's just very limited. So as an undergraduate student, I didn't know how to put that into words yet, but I could feel it instinctively. I could sense it that there isn't enough contextual information here for me to understand. I don't even know enough about like the history of like the periods from which these texts were taken, or even the larger texts that they're excerpted from. And as a student of British literature in particular at the time, I think I'm learning that like the larger context matters. So how can I read this if I don't have any sort of like frame to put it in or think about it with? So I put the book back and was like, I don't know how to read these archival references. Like, what is that archive of? Like, there's no information. So anyway, I put it back, and later I think was able to elaborate for myself like what the issues were, but at the time just felt like, I'm not ready for this. But these things incite, and then they stick with you, and then years later you are giving a talk at Queen's. So, but thankfully, like there were a lot of people who were probably incited, if not by her book, but by the dearth of work on Indigenous work anyway. A lot of Indigenous writers and thinkers who were trying to do this work. Jeanette Armstrong, Emma LaRocque, Armand Rufo, Deanna Rader, who Sam referred to, as well as many others. And so even though I wasn't ready in the moment when I met this book in the early 2000s, there was work that people were doing and a body of discussion that was being built by Indigenous thinkers and critics about how to, just even the literary history, but also like how to approach these texts, right? So Petroni's book was published in 1983. There were a lot of folks writing in, Indigenous folks writing about early stuff in the 90s and even earlier. And one could say, well, as an undergrad, you're a student, you could just like find Armand Rufo's essay, right, and like read it. It's like, yeah, but as an undergrad, right, there are limitations on what you're able to do, or your facility with certain research skills, or even your sense of like yourself as a researcher to have the confidence to say, like, I think this is something I want to look into, which is, yeah, I just think another aspect of education we need to think about. And thankfully too, there were other anthologies that came later. So 2011, we have Manitau, edited by Nigan Sinclair and Warren Carey, Anishinaabe and Métis scholars respectively, and then Kisaskatchewan, edited by Jessie Ray Archibald Barber, Cree-Métis scholar from Saskatchewan, and so in these anthologies, I think the editors are like thinking about, you know, what kind of contextual information is needed, what kind of background are people going to have to rely on to meet these texts. What do we need to give readers to have some introduction, at least, to some way into reading these pieces? And that's how they worked for me. So, but the thing is, they still can't offer everything, right? Like an anthology can only do so much. There's only so much framing you can offer a reader, and so there's still a lot of work to be done, which Indigenous literary critics continue to say in different ways in their works.